Hello everybody, and I'm Carol Marr I'm a lifelong learning and development leader from Edinburgh City Libraries, and today we're marking the anniversary of the Holocaust Memorial Day, which is the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, but it also commemorates other kind of atrocities and genocides that happened throughout the world. And I'm very pleased to have today the founders of Edinburgh Direct Aid, Denis and Jeanne. Hello there. And they're going to be talking about their work with Edinburgh Direct Aid, specifically in Bosnia, but also a wee bit about the work today and about those, a wee bit about those involved with the charity. So welcome to both of you, and just a wee bit before it was started, Denis and Jeanne have got a new puppy, so the puppy's now in the kitchen, so hopefully she'll behave herself very well. So we'll just kind of have a sort of conversation about some of the things relating to that. So I'll just start off with about, I mean, what was the catalyst for setting up EEDA?
Well, in the summer and autumn of 1992, the media were full of reports of what was happening in not only in Bosnia, but also in other parts of former Yugoslavia. And we were due to go on holiday in Crete, which is not very far away. And suddenly we began to think, gosh, are we really going to go walking in the hills of Crete while a few hundred miles away in Bosnia, you were seeing events which we haven't seen since World War II, concentration camps, ethnic cleansing, deportation trains with people locked in cattle trucks. Okay, it was on a smaller scale than the events of the Holocaust in World War II. But that this was happening in the middle of Europe was unbelievable, unbearable. And our government at the time had declared that, well, this was a faraway country where they were always at each other's throats and nothing much to do with us. And this dismissal by government made us both so indignant that when we read about somebody who was in the habit of driving down from Dover with his car and a trailer full of aid for refugees in Zagreb, we thought, wait a minute, we needn't go to Crete, we can join this chap instead. And we did just that. We gave him a ring, he said, could we join you? And he said, okay, meet me at Dover 2 weeks from now, Saturday morning. We had no idea what we were going to do, but that was the beginning.
Quite incredible. So it's just that kind of something, you see something and it's just that spur to action, really. So I mean, obviously, everybody kind of was watching the news and, you know, at that time and obviously seeing what was going on, but it's that acting upon things that makes the difference. So I'll just move on to kind of talking about, you know, how did you sort of witness or come in contact yourself with what was going on in Bosnia itself?
That first trip, we went to Croatia, and all sorts of rumors and stories were in the public domain about what was happening. And we, as aid novices, didn't know what to believe and what not to believe. But we were taken way beyond Zagreb, out to the east, to a little town called Lipik, where we met the doctor who had been looking after her community there. She was a Croat, and she was married to a Serb, and they had lived quietly in this small town, and she attended to the medical needs of the population. Then the war happened. Her husband left suddenly one night, And she was then swept up in the horrors of the war, of houses being burnt, of mosques being destroyed, of churches being desecrated, and people being killed or disappeared. And she stayed on in Lippi when she could have got away, and she cared for the population there. And as their supplies ran lower and lower, she was involved in doing all sorts of medical procedures that she'd never done before, and eventually without anesthetic. And we listened to this beautiful young woman telling her story. And that, I think, was a very powerful experience that we've never forgotten. And that, of course, led on to our later trips into Bosnia itself, where we certainly encountered other stories and histories of similar atrocities.
Of course, our next experience, not the immediately following, but perhaps the biggest experience of the kind we're talking about, being in contact with people who had directly known these atrocities, was when we went to Sarajevo, where everybody was in contact with what was happening. Their relatives, their friends could be killed on the street any time by a sniper or a shell landing. And our main contact there was a wonderful English woman called Maureen Lyons, or Maureen Checkers, married to a Bosnian doctor. And Maureen had a heart of gold and the courage of a lion. And she went everywhere in Sarajevo helping people, and she heard the most terrible stories. And when we first met her, she'd begun to work for the Kosovo hospital, which was in desperate plight because they had very, very little power, only that supplied by diesel generators, almost no water, windows destroyed here and there by shell fire. And that was our more direct experience of what was it actually like to be in those conditions. So yes, we have had that direct kind of contact.
How did you get, I mean, obviously this was the two of you, and obviously the organisation's grown. So how did others get involved then? It's one thing to act yourselves, but it's another thing to obviously set up a charity and embrace other people, and it is a volunteer-led organisation. I mean, did people sign up quite easily, or how did they find out about it? How did they get involved?
When we got back from our first trip, we thought we had no intention of doing anything more, but we were inundated by people who had heard of it and wanted to help. And suddenly we realized that we could not let this alone. This was a beginning, not an end. And that led in almost no time to a second, a third, a fourth, and later convoys, with people coming in to drive, to offer vehicles, to help collect goods, to pack and sort, and so on.
But actually, to tell the truth, Carol, on that very first trip into Zagreb, Denis had already formed the idea that he was going to go back to Sarajevo for Christmas. So irrespective of whether the volunteers joined us or not, he was going to go back again, and no doubt I was going to go too. But we were astonished by the number of people who came to us and said, we want to do something too. We want to do something.
Yeah, thanks very much. Obviously there was the war and obviously the country, but obviously there was, obviously specific kind of atrocities like the one obviously that happened in Srebrenica, where there was 8,000 plus men and boys that were murdered. And did you get the impression that these terrible acts were carried out by people of a violent and sadistic disposition at the edges of society, or was it just ordinary people who were just caught up in those times, or as you said, was it sort of poisoned by propaganda?
This is a question which I've often pondered, and I think that there's a mixture of answers to that. I suppose if it comes to real cruelty, personally carried out, it's probably not everybody. At least hopefully it's not everybody. But if it comes to more passive participation in events, you know, and you volunteer, well, not entirely passive, but it's like the role of a soldier. A soldier in war may kill people, but isn't necessarily a killer. And that applies also to people who are swept along in a tide of civil war. And my feeling is that, my belief is that there are very few of us who are capable of resisting these tides. And when there's a wave of combination of fear of the other side, hatred induced by everything you hear around you, that very few people stand out against that tide. So when it comes to ethnic cleansing in a village, for example, as carried out in Croatia, which Jeanne mentioned, where you're not directly killing people, but you're setting fire to their houses, probably almost all of us are capable of that. If it comes to pointing a gun at a group of women and children and men, probably fewer of us will do that voluntarily. But I think that that most of humanity has this capability for evil as well as good acts. And when there is a tide of propaganda, as there was in former Yugoslavia, as there was indeed in Germany enormously before the Holocaust began, I think very few can resist, unfortunately.
I mean, the same, yeah, I mean, all genocide, I suppose the really marked one was obviously in recent kind of memory was like Rwanda as well, you know, yeah, I mean, your neighbour, you know, it's incredible, but I suppose like these people are not the other, they're us, you know, too, you know, it is, you know, they're not different kind of human beings, isn't it? It's just the environment that implants that kind of hatred in people to perpetrate that kind of violence. And
it is whipped up. It's whipped up behind respectable sorts of theories like nationalistic pride. The other is the usurper. They need to be displaced and got rid of. All of these things put a more respectable cover on atrocities, I think.
I think also that there is always a part of the population who are only too willing to commit acts of violence. And if the lid is lifted on that, they will always come forward. Indeed, in a very small, it's not comparable, but we've seen this happen in Washington recently on a small scale, and sadly.
Very frightening when you see it. Very frightening.
I'm sure it leaves a quite permanent mark. It's not something you could possibly erase if you've witnessed. Sorry, I've got building work above me. I'm just going to mention this on this recording, so I'll be quite quick on my questions because you've got lesser noise at your end. So I'm just going to move on to kind of next kind of topic for discussion is like, so could what happened be described as the result of a long-standing interethnic hatred? Was that just like something which is suppressed and it just was just ready to...
This was often put forward as the explanation of events there, and it's not entirely without foundation. There was a long period of, I think if you read the history of the Balkans, there are long periods of interethnic quiet. Indeed, when the communities get together, intermarriage happens, and then it all falls asunder. And I think what makes it fall asunder is more to do with politics than anything else. But there is a basis for this, a basis for it in the sense that there are long-held beliefs about the other communities which can be rekindled and fired up. In Yugoslavia in particular, Tito wouldn't have any of that. And under Tito's regime, which lasted, I think, 30, 40 years, there was no interethnic clash. But once Tito had died, then different factions began to see how they could reinforce their position. In particular, the Serbs, who'd always were the strongest element, began to see that by refiring the old enmities, they could achieve a dominant position. And I think that's really what led to it there. But, and you could say that of the Holocaust itself and of the events we've seen in Europe since, that, you know, considering the Jews as a separate and possibly undesirable and part of society is an old entrenched belief and can be fired up as it was. I think it's something like that in Yugoslavia too.
Right. Do you think there was? I mean, obviously that was the excuse was in terms of this. Obviously, the Serbs and stuff like that. That there was same atrocities on both sides, or there was. I suppose what creates something such as a genocide is it's that single-sidedness, isn't it? You know, it's the scale of it, isn't it? It's the. I mean, what is your particular sort of perspective on that kind of narrative, that it was a reaction, that there was this kind of both sides?
Well, in terms of scale, there were atrocities committed by both sides. There were convictions at the International Criminal Court of people on the Bosnian, the Croat, and the Serbian side. However, the scale of things was quite different. There was, I mean, you might say that this was partly due to the fact that those who had the most power committed the most atrocities. Perhaps that was so, who can say? But certainly there was nothing comparable with Srebrenica or Omarska or Manjača or other massacres which committed by the Serbs, and even by the Croats didn't quite compare with that. And by the Bosniaks, very few. As I say, they didn't have the power, but nevertheless, those are the facts.
Yeah.
Seems to us that it was definitely initiated from the Serb side.
And we're not saying that there's anything, you know, what we really believe, I think both of us believe, that this is nothing to do with the Serbian people, except insofar as they've been exploited by politicians and leaders with dominance in mind, who chose an evil road to express that dominance or to achieve it.
Thanks for that. You sort of touched on, you know, obviously the atrocities in Srebrenica, but there was, in the scale of things, was Srebrenica the most, what would you say, I don't know, most terrible of the atrocities? And because sometimes, you know, in history, you know, it's like pick on sort of one thing, you know, and the other kind of events that happen are not necessarily forgotten about, but kind of marginalised.
Certainly in terms of numbers, Srebrenica was the biggest and worst, with something like 11,000 killed, and deliberately killed in the course of a few days. In Sarajevo, similar, possibly greater numbers were killed, but it was not the same thing. It was attrition. It was day after day of sniping and shelling, which over a number of years killed very many people. And it wasn't that face-to-face deliberate execution. But there were smaller events, in some of which we came into, how shall I say, close but retrospective contact with. many of the refugees who came to Edinburgh, who we got to know very well, came from a small town called Cluj in northwestern Bosnia. And after the Dayton Agreement, we helped them to return to their homes. And then we helped them rebuild their homes, because their homes had almost all been, if not completely destroyed, badly damaged by the usual technique of a firebomb. And through them, we learned of the events that had happened in Cluj. And there was a dreadful massacre of almost all the men in a small village, which led to the survivors coming to Edinburgh, actually. And that occurred in 1992, which is a long time before Srebrenica. But it wasn't 11,000, but it was 1,100, which for a village that size was huge. And there it was, as you, going back to your first question, it was an apparently united community suddenly rent asunder, with some of the people taking a hand in the massacre being people who had been considered to be friends. Yes.
This business of numbers has always bothered me, Carol. Srebrenica was a turning point for the war in Bosnia in that it was followed by a response at last, an effective response. But before that, in Sarajevo itself, there was a horrible event in the marketplace where a large number of people, about 28 of them, were shot as they queued for bread.
They weren't shot, love, they were hit by a shell.
Yes, hit by a shell, that's right. And there was horror here. But as Denis says, before that, day on day on day, one after another had been killed in Sarajevo. And for each of those families, it was a tragedy as big as perhaps what happened elsewhere, but the numbers didn't stack up. The numbers didn't alert horror in Western societies. And yet, it is just as tragic.
I know it's that that impact on that community, you know, which is the devastating effect kind of thing. But it's like what is seen as like newsworthy or not newsworthy, you know. Right. And as you say, sometimes it does come down to numbers, and the fact that obviously even like today, you know, there's very little. You know, there's very little news really on mainstream news about what's going on today, isn't there? You know, people have got to seek it out.
It depends very much where you are.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a European or American killed by a terrorist, local terrorist, whether it's 1 or 3 or 5, it's a tremendous news. If it's a Palestinian shot in the West Bank or Gaza, if it's 5, that's not interesting. Even 10, 100, yes, we'll take notice. Unfortunately, that's how it is.
Mm-hmm.
Numbers.
I know. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I was talking about some of the events obviously in this kind of the Cluj and obviously in some other places kind of thing. In terms of obviously after the war, but you know, can maybe say something about the reconciliation between those who were in conflict, or you know, the perpetrators and the victims of these atrocities. Has there been a kind of bridge built now, would you say?
Well, I would say the actual perpetrators, there would not be a bridge to the actual perpetrators, but to the community. I think you had some information on that, Jan.
Yes. As Denis says, if somebody was known to have committed atrocities, I think they would not have been welcomed back. But at a personal level, in the small villages where we helped to reconstruct, an attempt was made to recreate the multi-ethnic community that they had been before. And so although many Serbs opted to stay in Serb-controlled areas of the country after the Dayton Agreement, then some did prefer to come back to their original homes. And we know of instances where a majority Muslim village would set out to welcome a Serb family returning and would make sure that their home was vacated by somebody who had been perhaps occupying it during the war, was cleaned and refurnished, and that there would be a welcome for that family coming back. And I think in the circumstances of what had just happened, that is a very remarkable occurrence. And again, it's not newsworthy, it's just one small community. It does show that people can rise above what has happened to them and be magnanimous in their response.
I suppose that's, yeah, something to hold on to, the fact that, you know, there is hope for people, you know, or beyond what happened kind of thing, you know. Yeah. Maybe let's kind of move on a wee bit into, you know, about your own kind of personal motivation to act, and about your, I mean, were you involved with, you know, before you setting up Edinburgh Direct Aid and taking that kind of, you know, what in terms of your own work or personal life, was there anything that kind of made that, not an obvious step, but kind of, I don't know,
I suppose in my
transition.
Case, my background, I was born in South Africa, and you can grow up in South Africa without being conscious of racial division and persecution. I mean, you're going back now to the apartheid and pre-apartheid era, which was much the same, but I certainly didn't. Also, I'm Jewish by origin, and South Africa was a pretty anti-Semitic place amongst the whites, so I was conscious of that too. But I'd never engaged in aid work. What I had engaged in was some anti-apartheid campaigning, but just remained conscious of things in the world. And I suppose that, as I said originally, I was just found it shocking that these events were allowed to recur in Europe many years after the Holocaust itself.
I'm a doctor by background, a pathologist, and I, at the stage that we were considering going to Crete on holiday, had an all-consuming, very busy career. But as a doctor, you are aware, of course, of the sanctity of life and the need to be humane towards your fellow humans. But I had never been involved in aid work before. And as Denis and I set out to Croatia on that first trip, I never imagined that we would suddenly be flung into the world of aid, and that we would be aid workers, if there is such a definition, 30 years later, both now retired, full-time working at trying to bring some comfort to some communities.
Will you ever retire?
I'll do one day.
Well, the difference is nobody pays us.
But it's like, yeah, good for you, yeah. So in terms of the you know, you obviously the work, Edinburgh Direct Aid's work in Bosnia, you know, what was the kind of, in terms of awareness raising back home? Do you think that made quite an impact in terms of the publicity you got, or about raising awareness within Edinburgh and beyond a wee bit? What was going on?
I suppose that we had a little bit of public awareness in our first year of operating, but of course the event that brought us to real public notice was on one of our convoys in and out of Sarajevo in 1993. One of our volunteers was shot dead. And that dreadful day when Christine Whitcutt lost her life was, of course, publicized widely here. And her widower, Alan, was a quite noble representative of what he believed, which was forgiveness and reconciliation. And he went on to be of material help and support to EDA, going out to Bosnia, working with us for all the remaining years of his life. And he died just this last year. And so suddenly EDA was better known in Edinburgh for what one might say the wrong reasons. And then, of course, a couple of years later, Denis himself was shot, but he survived. But there were other ways in which EDA came to the notice of people by word of mouth. It's a very powerful spread of news. And we had by this time a fleet of trucks which we ferried aid to Bosnia. And we used to take the trucks out into Edinburgh and invite people in their own communities to bring us whatever they would like to send, and we would make sure that it got there. And in that way also, I think EDA came to the notice of people.
Well, it raised raised awareness in a political sense, I doubt, but it did make people aware that there were others needing help. And I think we did draw in numbers of people and continue to do so.
In terms of I mean, obviously you've got a whole host of people volunteering. I mean, it's incredible that it's, you know, the organisation's totally volunteer-led. I mean, I think we spoke in another conversation about how do you think that the kind of work and what people do in terms of for the charity, it doesn't, whether it's working and putting stuff together for aid to go over in the warehouse, work in the warehouse and stuff to go over to, well, at the moment, isn't it? It's down to over in the Lebanon, the Syrian refugees. And obviously there's people working in situ over there too. I mean, what kind of impact do you think that has made on the volunteers themselves in terms of getting involved with Edinburgh Direct Aid?
I am quite sure that Edinburgh Direct Aid could not have survived for 30 years if it was just still Denis and me. And right from the outset, people have come to join us in and to help, all motivated by a wish to help and helping in the ways that they could. Some have gone abroad with EDA and delivered aid themselves in Bosnia and Kosovo and in other places where we have worked. And others have stayed here and done incredibly valuable work in packing up. I don't know how many tons of aid we have sent overseas since we started. And people have come and gone. They've given their time as they could. Some of us have been with us from the very beginning, given 30 years of their lives to helping, not helping EDA, but to helping those that we try to help. We don't matter. It's who we go to. Those are the people who matter. And the willingness of so many people are aware of the need and they're willing to offer their time for free, volunteers, every one of them. We pay nobody except the people that we employ in other countries.
But it also makes a great difference to these people.
It does.
I think we could.
No, you carry on.
You know, it's amazing how, I mean, we never expected this at all when we were first founded EDA. We didn't think of this aspect of it, but in some cases it has transformed the life of people. Sometimes in a very obvious way, when they've, having come out a few times of EDA, they've gone into a career of aid. And some of our volunteers have risen very high in big organizations where they do get paid.
Yes.
But even, you know, leaving aside those, there are others who it's given focus and meaning to lives which were somewhat on the rocks. And that, well, I can only say we're very glad that that has happened.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it brings out, it's an opportunity to bring out the best in people. And they discover friendships and support and a community here in Edinburgh also, and wider afield. Some of our key people in EEDA are not in Edinburgh. Think of a few around the UK.
Our all-purpose Wonder Woman, Maggie Tukey, who leads our Lebanon operation, she's really from Skipton. But we consider that her an honorary Scot. So.
Yes.
Yeah, fabulous, really, you know, incredible, you know, in terms of people's commitment and stuff like that, including not just yourself, but obviously for the volunteers kind of thing. So just a couple of other kind of questions kind of thing. So what are your words of advice for others who feel inspired to act? Well, can I just read the wee theme? There's a wee kind. There's obviously a reference to this year's kind of the Holocaust Memorial Day theme. Can I just read that out? It's just Holocaust Memorial Day enables us to remember for a purpose. It gives us a responsibility, work for a safer, better future for everyone. Everyone can step up and use their talents to tackle prejudice, discrimination and intolerance wherever we encounter them.
That everyone is a powerful word, isn't it? And if we think about the little old lady who's housebound, what could she do? Well, the answer is that she can be inspired to knit or to make things for somebody abroad. And it is this kind of dedicated help. And in doing so, they are themselves helped. As Denis says, it gives a sense of purpose. And it is always uplifting to the human spirit, I believe, to be of help to somebody else.
But when it comes to tackling intolerance, prejudice and discrimination, I don't know. Helping people is something that everybody rises to. I hope that in doing that, they themselves will lose their prejudices, but I'm not actually sure that always happens. In terms of the impact of aid work, and especially the aid work of a small organization like ours, we do help. We make life easier for some of the victims of oppression and atrocity in the areas which we are in contact with. But there's nothing we can do about the causes. And if you look around the world today, you see awful events on the most enormous scale, as in with the Uyghurs, with the Chinese, but many other communities. And I'm not sure, I'm afraid this is not the message you want to hear, but I think it is very important to do aid work. I think that everybody who's thinking of it should go there, do it, but don't expect too much. Be happy that you can help somebody, but I'm not sure that you will have an impact on the world as a whole, unfortunately.
I think part of the answer is in young people and education, and to bring these matters to schools and to children. And one important small aspect of our work is the filling of shoeboxes, and school children who each fill a shoebox to send to a needy child in somewhere where we work, for instance. And this isn't confined to our charity. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, I hope that they and their parents give some thought to where that's going.
Mm. Yes, I think it must make a difference for people when people start thinking of a refugee as somebody you help rather than somebody who's going to invade your country and take away your jobs, as the vicious amongst us would proclaim. Yeah.
I suppose that's that even small shift kind of thing in thinking, or that wider humanity, isn't it? You know, I just want to finish off now because, in fact, you've been very open and very. I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this, there'll be things that they've or not aware, or maybe just brought it back to them. The kind of things that went on, certainly, in Bosnia, and obviously just finding out a bit more about the work of Edinburgh Direct Aid and your own involvement too. So finally, I'd like to ask you, obviously, for speaking from my library hat on, right? If you were to write a book about Edinburgh Direct Aid, if you're thinking about writing a book, you maybe have, or writing at this moment, what would the title be?
Well, I have to tell you that I'm not thinking of writing a book, but there's a man called Fred Bridgeland, who is an established author of various books, a retired foreign journalist, foreign correspondent, who has been working on a book on Edinburgh Direct Aid for some time. It'll probably be ready this year. And his proposed title, I think, is With Love from Scotland, but I would prefer it to be With Love to Sarajevo, perhaps.
No, it can't just be to Sarajevo,
No,
because
true.
we've been to Sri Lanka, we've been to Kashmir,
Yeah,
we've been
true.
to the West Bank, we've been to Kenya, and we're
Okay.
now working in Lebanon and Syria. So it has to be from Scotland with love to the world.
Something like that.
Right, I just want to thank you both very, very much, actually, for agreeing to join in the conversation on this Day of Remembrance. And if for those that are listening, if you want to find out a bit more about the work, you can check out the Edinburgh Direct Aid website. I'll put a wee note on that. And obviously, if you want about the Holocaust Memorial Day too, I'll put a link up about that too. So thank you again. And your puppy will probably be wanting a wee bit of attention now, sitting very patiently in your kitchen. And good luck to yourselves and to those that are involved with Edinburgh Direct Aid with your current work now and for future projects. All the very best.
Well, thank you very much for having us, Carol, and we're delighted to be able to contribute.
Right, thank you.